Today we're going to begin our next unit, which is Reconstruction. The dates on this period were 1865 to 1877. Reconstruct. Root word here is construct, which means to build. The prefix is re, build again. And therefore we get our definition of Reconstruction, which is the period of time after the Civil War in which the North and South came back together and attempt to fix the problems caused by the Civil War. We're going to see very quickly in this unit that Reconstruction was difficult and a lot of the problems between the North and the South were not solved. So a quote from Lincoln: "With malice, hatred towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive or try on to finish the work we are in, to bind or fix up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace." So this was spoken at Lincoln's second inaugural address in March of 1865 when the war was winding down. The war is not over, but at this point, everyone knows that the North's going to win. It's just a matter of time. So the nation was beginning to look to Lincoln to lead the nation once the war was over. However, well, he had some post-war plans set up, but as you guys know, I believe, 5 days after the war ended, Lincoln was assassinated. And I'm going to put the definition of assassinate up on the screen. Assassinate means the killing of an important person, often for political reasons. So if I was killed, it would not be an assassination. We always have to look at the motive behind it, and it has to involve politics in some way. So most of the time when we talk about assassinations, we're talking about a president or maybe a judge or a congressperson, so on and so forth. So let's quickly look through the story. So the date of this was April 14th, 1865. It was 5 days after the Civil War had ended. Our location is Ford's Theater, which is in Washington, D.C. It's still there. It's still a theater. You can go and visit and see where the assassination took place. But they still do plays there, I believe, at Christmas time. So Lincoln and his wife and a couple other guests. This was a guy in the Army, his fiance, his wife. They went to the theater that night. Lincoln originally, he didn't want to go, but his wife had planned it, so he felt obligated to go see it with them. Here's the part that most people do not know. Most Americans know that Lincoln was assassinated, but the whole plan was a little bit more complex than that. There were three main people that were involved: John Wilkes Booth, he's the famous one out of this, but there were two others, Lewis Powell and George Atzerodt. And their plan that night was not only to kill Abraham Lincoln, but the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, and the Secretary of State, who was a man named William Seward. I'll show you pictures in just a second. So these attacks were supposed to happen simultaneously at the same time. And the hope, this is the motive behind the killing, was that if these three people were killed, it would throw the government into chaos and allow the South to be its own country or continue to be its own country. So that's the motive. So Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and Seward. So let's talk about the other two guys first. Lewis Powell fought in the Confederate Army, injured at Gettysburg, captured by the Union Army. He agrees to kill Seward. Goes over to his house that night. Seward had been ill. He pretends that he's delivering medicine. He's let inside the house. Goes up to Seward's bedroom and proceeds to stab him over and over again. He also stabbed two of Seward's sons who rushed in to help. Everyone survived the attack. Powell was later caught and hung for his attempted murder. George Atzerodt, German immigrant, came to the United States, 1843. I don't know how he was involved with this, how he knew Booth and the other and Powell. It doesn't really matter. He agrees to kill Andrew Johnson that night. However, he got nervous. He got scared. He went to a bar and proceeded to drink all night. He was also later captured and hung. You might think, well, he didn't commit a crime. He didn't try to. He still was charged with attempted murder. He was part of a plan to kill an elected official. Finally, we moved to John Wilkes Booth. He was born in Maryland. He was a Southerner. He was actually very, very famous. Most Americans were familiar with him before the assassination because he was a famous actor. This was a time period, we don't have movie theaters, so stage actors were your movie stars of the day. Very, very pro-South, attended the hanging of John Brown. He originally, you can tell from this, I'm trying to establish that he had motive going back. In 1864, he had a plan to kidnap Lincoln. And if he had gone through this and if he was successful, he was going to trade Lincoln for Confederate prisoners of war and force the North to end the war. Obviously, never went through with that. Here's an interesting picture. This is Lincoln at his second inaugural address. I've circled where Lincoln was. That's John Wilkes Booth up in the crowd where my cursor is. He later said he had an excellent chance to kill the president if he had wished. Obviously, he didn't go through with it that day. So the night of the murder, they take a carriage ride to Ford's Theater in D.C. from the White House. His guard back during this time period, there was no Secret Service to protect the president. When the president went out in public, a policeman from the local force would go out and protect the president. His protection that day was John F. Parker, who ended up not being a very good selection. He had a pretty questionable record with the police. He'd been caught sleeping on the job before. He had been also caught drinking on the job. So Lincoln was seated in a private box above the stage. I'll show you some pictures that helps explain this. So this is the inside of Ford's Theater. Where my cursor is, this is the stage, and then there's seats that go back up. You can kind of see the edge of them. And then, like a lot of old theaters, it had like a second level or a second story, more seats up here, and it looks like maybe even had a third story. Anyway, Lincoln was seated up here where my cursor is. So he was looking directly down on the side of the stage. And he was seated up there because it was its own private little room. There was a hallway back behind with a door that could be locked. Parker was supposed to be out there guarding him. You wouldn't want the president like in the main theater sitting next to hundreds of people. A little bit better picture. Lincoln would have been seated right there. Anyhow, most plays have intermission, kind of like a halftime. He left at intermission to go to the local bar. It was unclear if he ever returned. He certainly was not there when Booth arrived. So Booth, during the second part of the play, he shows up. He gets into the private box where Lincoln and the other guests are seated, and he waited for a point in the play where there would be a lot of laughter in the audience. So his hope was he would shoot the president and no one would hear the gunshot. So that's what he did. He walks up right behind Lincoln, shoots him point blank in the back of the head. He slumps over. He doesn't die. One of the guests that was with Lincoln, the guy in the army, he jumps and goes right after John Wilkes Booth, trying to stop him. Booth also had a knife, stabs Rathbone in the arm. There's kind of a struggle. And then Booth, this wasn't a part of the plan. Instead of going back out the way he came, he's going to jump from that private box onto the stage. As he was jumping, his riding spur caught, and he lands awkwardly, and he shattered his shin bone. So he's pretty severely injured at this point. However, he runs across the stage, goes out the back of the stage, goes down these stairs to an alleyway, goes out in the alleyway, and there's a horse there, so he can make his escape. This is the most famous image of the Booth/Lincoln assassination. Meanwhile, Lincoln doesn't die immediately. They take him across the street. We've talked about medical care. It wasn't great. He kind of slips in and out of consciousness throughout the night. He dies early the next day. Obviously, the nation was, especially Northerners, was in a state of shock. Booth, meanwhile, he goes on the run. He gets out of Washington, D.C. He goes into Virginia. The army is sent to find him, to bring him to justice. They catch him a week, 10 days later. They find him in a barn in Virginia. They set fire to the barn. A couple soldiers shoot in there. They killed him in the barn. They pulled him out. He doesn't die right away. As he was dying, he says, "Tell my mother I die for my country." In the end, 8 people were convicted or found guilty, and 4 were executed for their parts in the plot to kill Abraham Lincoln. So I found this. This is a pretty interesting article. This is from a newspaper in Alabama. Alabama, obviously the South. If you read their headline, "Glorious News, Lincoln and Seward Assassinated." So it tells you from the perspective of Southerners they didn't always